I must say, Florida Power and Light, where's Eric?
Right here.
Eric, there are more electrical people in this state, I think, than ever accumulated anywhere in the world, is what I read before.
Miami-Dade state attorney says disgraced lawmaker Frank Artiles masterminded a plot to help a Republican win a key Florida state Senate seat. Part of a pattern CNN previously reported last year. 3 races with ghost candidates supported by political action committees that all registered at the same time and had similar donations and similar spending on nearly identical mailers.
There was also hundreds of thousands of dollars of dark money. We still don't know where it came from.
You're back once again for another episode of Why Are We Like This, the true crime podcast that treats Florida like the active crime scene that it is. I'm David Quinones, and I'm joined by my co-hosts again, Tomas Kennedy. Tomas, what's up, man?
You know, it's just hanging in here. We were spared the worst of Hurricane Ian in South Florida, but the rest of the state fared pretty bad. So, you know.
Yeah, not great. And we're going to get into it. On the other line, we've got my other co-host, Gerald Doherty. Jerry, how are you?
I'm doing okay. What is it? We're remarking on that we're getting the very last remnants of Ian up here. So it's been a rainy 3 days, but not nearly anything like, the destruction and devastation that you guys are seeing down there. So everyone, it's weird. Everyone up here is very grateful to have it because we were going through a drought for a while. So, I mean, at least we'll have drinking water for the foreseeable future.
Great, Gerald. Way to make it all about you. Wonderful. Thank you.
I'm just saying. You asked me how I am, and I told you, and now you're mad at me for giving you an answer.
So our guest this week is Alissa Jean Schafer, a policy strategy and communications consultant who does research and communications work for the Energy and Policy Institute. You can find her on Twitter at Alissa Jean or online at AlissaJeanSchafer.com. Alissa, welcome to Why Are We Like This?
Thank you so much. Good to be here with y'all.
So before we get to this episode's case file, a bit of housekeeping. This marks our 6th episode. We've got a lot more planned. We've all been sort of laying out a calendar of episodes that we're going to be releasing through the end of the year. So be sure to subscribe, rate, review. I don't know if you know how podcasts work, but as a new independent non-corporate, not money-backed podcast, we need your reviews to go up in the rankings, which will help more people find us, which means more subscribers and more ratings and more reviews and on and on. In business school, we call this a virtuous cycle. So hit that follow button, please. Also, if you want to, find us on Twitter, Instagram, and on TikTok at Walt Show, WAWLT Show. So on to this week's topic.
We are leaving our country because of big tech election interference.
The news this week in Florida is still, as we've alluded to, leading with the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, and we're starting to get a clearer picture of the scope of the damage that was wrought by the storm. Fort Myers, Port Charlotte, wide swath of the Gulf Coast between Naples and Tampa sustained enormous, unprecedented damage. The storm surges in some places were as high as 10 feet. In Lee County, the officials are just now finishing repairs on the county's water main, restoring clean water to the 750,000 plus residents there. And now we already had a case file scheduled to discuss this this week prior to Ian. And as luck would have it, that topic dovetails quite conveniently with the larger hurricane storyline, or inconveniently, depending on whether you're one of the hundreds of thousands of Floridians who are still without power right now. Of those, about 225,000 are customers of Florida Power and Light, the state's leading energy provider and the subject of no shortage of controversy and scrutiny in recent years. Up until recently, FPL had been one of those mundane, mostly benign parts of the landscape of life in Florida. It's just a bill that is probably set for auto pay from your checking account, something that you rarely think about, other than occasionally wondering why it seems to be getting incrementally more and more expensive every so often. Not unlike our episode 1 case file, where we explored homeowners insurance and what a racket that industry has become. A lot has been happening behind the scenes in Florida's energy markets for a long time, and only now are many people beginning to sit up and take notice. And to think it all started with one third-year Democratic senator from right here in our own backyard in Miami. Now, Alissa, I want to kind of start with you and bring up this topic of power purchase agreements. I don't know if that's maybe a good place to start with this, but and Tomas, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, because in 2019, my state senator, Jose Javier Rodriguez was working hard to push forward these power purchase agreements, and that seems like it was almost the impetus for a lot of the story that we want to talk about today. What are power purchase agreements, and like why do they matter as at the sort of genesis of this? What ends up being kind of a scandal?
So I'm happy to take that. I'm not sure if that was directed to me. That's certainly one place that we could start. In my opinion, all of this starts years prior, but just to kind of level set. So here in Florida, it's a monopoly utility market. That means that whoever your power provider is, for many people, that's Florida Power and Light, FPL, that's who you're stuck with. You don't have any choice other than that. A power purchase agreement would allow you to purchase power from somebody else or a different entity. And in this context specifically, it would allow you to purchase solar power. So this actually, we saw this come up with the original like Floridians for Solar Choice ballot amendment back in 2016 that FPL also mobilized millions of dollars behind. And it's a similar concept that we saw from Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez, whereas let's say, for example, in Florida, we have a high percentage of folks who rent, including myself until very recently. So as a renter, you don't have an option. Let's say you want to have solar power. But if, for example, you are in, let's say, a duplex and the landlord wanted to put solar on his units in that duplex and then sell it to you, well, that seems like a great solution. Well, that's actually illegal because right now, Florida statute would declare that landlord to be a utility, and the only person who is allowed to be a utility are the ones that are currently sanctioned in the state of Florida. So you got FPL, TECO, Duke. So introducing the market or the business possibility of PPAs, power purchase agreements, would be a direct attack on the bottom line for those utilities. So anytime this prospect has come up as a potential policy, whether it's on a ballot initiative or being introduced by somebody like JJR, all the alarms seem to go off in every executive office for NextEra and their company here, Florida Power and Light. Again, because it gets at their bottom line. And that year and year again, we see their bottom line is their number one priority. And it seems that they will cross just about any, and we can, whether it's illegal, unethical, whatever, there are a lot of lines that they are apparently willing to cross in order just to protect that bottom line and their profits.
So I don't want to start by getting like cutesy and being a smartass, but what you describe seems to me like big government intervention to prevent Floridians from accessing as many energy choices as possible. And it just seems odd to me that in the so-called free state of Florida you have such a regulated market into what can be a utility that prevents us as individuals from again maximizing our choices in terms of where we want to derive our power from, and like our and our options in terms of affordability. I don't know, is that like a fair assessment?
Yeah, the concept of having freedom to generate your own power, sell your own power, purchase your own power on a small scale. We're not talking like, what you see in fields that FPL is building. But the option to do that is very popular across political lines. This is not a partisan issue. This is a monopoly wanting to make the most money possible issue. And right now, that monopoly is completely protected. There's pros and cons, like all of our systems of government and regulation, checks and balances. There's pros and cons to all these different methods. But in Florida, the way it's supposed to work, since we do have this monopoly, is they're supposed to be kept in check by the Public Service Commission, Office of Public Counsel, legislature, and even the governor's office. He has veto power, obviously. But what we've seen by and large over the last several years is all of those bodies that are supposed to keep companies like FPL in check are completely captured. So yeah, at the end of the day, you have this big government protected multi-billion-dollar corporation just churning out as much profit as possible.
And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but have you guys worked, because this seems like a free market solution, honestly, to like the issue of energy consumption and energy freedom in Florida. But have you guys worked with like libertarian groups, the Cato Institute, like small government minded conservatives, to basically course correct these? Again, it sounds cutesy, but big government conservatives in Tallahassee?
Yeah, so for me personally, with the 2016 ballot initiative, for example, I was not working with EPI at that time. I was with a different organization, and the coalition behind the Solar Choice Initiative was extremely bipartisan. We had Republicans, we had Libertarians. It was kind of everybody across the board all agreed on this one issue. Maybe nothing else politically, but they agreed on this. And moving forward, like there's all types of coalitions that are on the same page just with solar rights in general. I think we even saw that in the most recent legislative session with FPL's their anti-rooftop solar bill. The solar industry you have to think of it as an extension of the electrical industry, the construction industry, the roofing industry. A lot of those small business owners are Republicans. Their families are Republicans, their employees are Republicans, and they see this as a business issue at the end of the day. So short answer to your question is yes, there are people working on all angles, all political persuasions, because this is one thing that a lot of people agree with, and that is that folks should have more freedom in their electric bill and where that electricity comes from.
Tomas, that's a really good point, because this is one of those sort of revolving door issues, right, Alissa, where you see a lot of people sort of coming and going. You see a lot of folks who it doesn't break neatly on like a left or right partisan line. This reminds me a lot of people in Washington, D.C. in their post D.C. career when they go into the private sector. What else is it that makes FPL and their parent Next Era such a sort of like consolidated force? And from here, I'm going to try to jump us into the nut of this scandal and talk a little bit about what happened with Jose Javier Rodriguez's political career in 2019. But can you explain like what differentiates? Why does FPL have this stranglehold? Like what is so unique about them?
So part of it just comes down to geography and numbers. It's fairly black and white. If you look at service territory maps, Florida Power and Light, they control over 6 million customer accounts. And that's an important distinction, customer accounts versus people. So right now, in the aftermath of Ian, all the numbers being reported, those are customer account numbers, not people. So when we're talking about, 200,000 people still waiting for power, it's actually 200,000 customer accounts. So that actual number, if you think about a home that has a family of like 5 people, multiply that by 200,000, and that gives you a better idea of the level of impact we're talking about. So taking it back to how did FPL become this like 800-pound gorilla in the room? They have, over the last decade or so, just by acquiring smaller companies, they recently merged with Gulf Power. So now they have the Panhandle is in their portfolio as well. They have just grown and they control a lot of the major metropolitan areas. So now for the whole state of Florida, they are providing power to over 12 million people. And that is a huge chunk of folks that make up Florida.
Yeah.
And the other thing, to FPL's credit, they, at the end of the day, they are a business and they are laser focused on being a profitable business. So they have made really smart decisions in terms of investing in strategies to have some of the smartest teams, the biggest teams, millions of dollars in lobbying, millions of dollars in their own staff who lobby all the way down to the city commission level, just investing in these political relationships. Yeah, I think in the political landscape, we talk about, quote unquote, building the bench. Well, FPL builds the bench, and they have been building that bench for years. They're very strategic. And it all comes down to how they can maintain power over the regulatory system. Something interesting, in all of the thinking about who controls power, whether it's the legislature or whatever, that the Republicans, obviously, they've had a supermajority for, I think it's since 2011. In recent years, the Senate majority has literally been 4 seats. And so that was like our closest chance. Now, if you look at all the elections that FPL and FPL consultants have been connected to in this broader scandal story, it's 4 seats. So you have a 4-seat majority. You have 4 seats that FPL and FPL consultants chose to pay very close attention to, spend millions of dollars on through this web of nonprofits. And you have 4 years of power. And in that 4 years, we've seen Public Service Commission appointments. We've seen legislation that replaced the Office of Public Counsel. We've seen multi-billion-dollar rate increases. So all of these different pieces kind of come together and paint a picture of what appears to be just a very large, very strategic monopoly utility doing everything they can to protect their bottom line.
Yeah, and you mentioned all of those various investments that they make, and one of those investments is in not just media relations, but in media itself, in actually, leveraging their power of the purse to like concoct media coverage. And for that, I want to just read a little bit from. It's so funny to read this because we're going to borrow for this episode from some of the great reporting by the Orlando Sentinel, Miami Herald in recent months. Who broke this, who were among the first to break this story. But there's a little bit of show lore here for why are we like this, heads, because coming out of this scandal is the conversation that Tomas and I first had to actually start this show up and actually start making this show. This was in the wake of this great reporting that was done. So from that, I'm going to read a short piece from the Orlando Sentinel. The lead is the headline is, if you want to look for it, it's Dark Power, How FPL other utilities neutralize opponents and grow profit. And the lead is, the CEO of the biggest power company in the U.S. had a problem. A Democratic state senator was proposing a law that could cut into FPL's profits. Landlords would be able to sell cheap rooftop solar power directly to their tenants, bypassing FPL and their monopoly on electricity. Quote, I want you to make his life a living hell. Seriously. This was written by FPL's CEO, Eric Silligy, in a 2019 email to two of his vice presidents about, who have we been talking about? State Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez, who had proposed that legislation. Now, if that was just idle talk between a very powerful CEO and some people in his C-suite, that would be one thing. It would be worrying, but it would be I don't know, maybe manageable, forgivable, private correspondence between people. But it became more than that, didn't it?
Full disclosure, because we do try to abide for the barest of journalistic integrity and why are we like this. But I was a former employee of Jose Javier Rodriguez, and I can attest that guy really tried to do the right thing at every step of the way. And, he really was a thorn on the side of FPL. At the interest of us, Floridians and consumers, and and that's exactly why Eric Silligy and FPL executives wanted him out. And that email that you're referring to, that was leaked by the investigations from the Orlando Sentinel, Miami Herald, was addressed to consultants from a consultancy firm called Matrix LLC, that was basically hired by FPL to, quite frankly, and to put it bluntly, to engage in all sorts of election fraud schemes to advance the interest of Florida Power and Light in the state, at the expense of us, working class people and Floridians. The ghost candidate schemes that we've referred to and that we'll talk more about, that was them. They, even before that, they worked with a Democratic Party consultant named Dan Newman to propose a plan to primary JJR from the center and to take him out in his district in a Democratic primary, because they know that's a blue Democratic leaning seat, and it would have been difficult to get a Republican in there, which is what they ultimately did. And as Alissa referenced, this is all in service of approving their cronies in the Public Service Commission, because the governor appoints and the Senate confirms. And Alissa, one thing that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one thing that it's worth pointing out to the public is these election schemes from FPL and associated, entities are always focused on the Florida Senate. They're never focused on the Florida House, right? And again, because I think it all revolves around defanging the Public Service Commission and making it a rubber stamp entity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. first of all, I think it's focused on the Senate in recent years because that's the closest that Democrats have come at at even having a chance at breaking the trifecta that Republicans have had for such a long time. But then the other element of that is, of course, the Public Service Commission. And Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez, he is one of the only, I'm the type of person, I watch public hearings at the Public Service Commission, try and sift through the dockets. So I know for a fact, Representative Escamani is him. JJR and Escamani, those two are the only elected officials in recent years that I have seen actually testify at a public service hearing on behalf of their constituents, because the Public Service Commission is talking about things like, do we want to give FPL permission to raise rates by billions of dollars? And the answer is usually yes.
Usually yes, yeah.
So, Jose Javier Rodriguez, along with Representative Ana Escamani, they're in all of the people in legislature, they're the only two in recent history that I've seen show up at the PSC for these really important discussions. So JJR certainly, as soon as he started speaking up, seemed to have a target on his back, unfortunately.
And for 20 years, we've mentioned this on a few different episodes, Tomas, but maybe we should clarify for folks who maybe haven't been here for so long, or maybe are out-of-state listeners. When we say that there's a trifecta of Republican control in the state of Florida, there's a lot baked into that statement. Okay, not only has the state been run, by a Republican executive since the year 2000, but both of the legislatures in this 50-50 narrow, every single year narrow election state, this up until recently prototypically purple state. When you look at it, it's really like a 70-30 breakdown. Like it's a pretty strong supermajority in both chambers of in both houses, in the upper and lower houses. Like it's very rare, to Alyssa's point earlier, that Democrats are within a striking distance of maybe a handful of seats for control of either of the chambers. So it's very undemocratic at its core. The reason, the way that a 50-50 state can end up being 70-30, 75-25 like that. But I think it's important for people to understand, like, when we say a trifecta, it's really strong, firm hands. It's firmly in the hands of one party, and it has been for quite some time. Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to kind of give that context really quickly, because I think people forget, Florida 50-50. I bet that they probably have had, some Democrats in charge. No, man. No, they haven't. Not really. What we're getting into as we talk about Matrix, and we get into, by the way, also in keeping with Tomas's call for transparency, I should mention that Why Are We Like This did get a $300,000 grant from the Capitalist. So just so everybody knows that I'm just kidding. I saw Alyssa's face for a second. Go, wait, what? I do want to bring up, though.
Yeah, Alissa, this is going to be heavily edited against you. Sorry.
That's why I asked.
But no, I do want to bring up, because Alissa, I know you work in communications, as do I, and the idea of the audacity of what was done in this communication strategy, because I find it fascinating that you've got a company, Next Era, and then FPL as a subsidiary, that are unlimited in funds. Like, they could do anything. They have the kind of profits they get probably rival a lot of countries, right, in terms of GDP, and they could do anything. And rather than working to innovate or improve operations or try to, address hard lines or hardening their system or hardening their grid or doing any of these other types of things that they probably have to do in the course of their work, the main thing they went with was a communications response. And that communications response involved basically co-opting what I think to a lot of casual observers is had been just a very run-of-the-mill political blog, political media, operation. So maybe you can start by explaining to us what the Capitalist is and why it's important in this story.
Yeah, and why I made such a ridiculous face when you dropped that name. I will say, because you mentioned, they could be spending their money on storm hardening. Relevant to what is happening right now and what CEO Eric Szilagyi has been talking to the press multiple times a day, they do have storm hardening going on, and customers are paying for it. actually the Florida legislature approved charging even more to customers so that they can do that. So they're very protective of their profits, and whenever they are doing something, they like to do what is called cost recovery on that investment, which translates into Floridians paying more. But anyways, just a little tidbit on that. So the capitalist is what is considered kind of like a Politico, like for politicos type of news, quote unquote news website. And at first glance, it feels very niche, like obviously, yeah, quotation marks, big ones. It feels like, okay, this is probably a very targeted audience. But once you start looking at their social media, for example, on Facebook, you can see that they're spending thousands of dollars on advertising and they're targeting people all over the state. So this is not just some political newsletter that gets sent to 250 people, you know. This is a social media platform that thousands of dollars gets put behind to blast out what ends up being blatantly misleading articles. And, you know, I think, you know, in the communications world, we're used to opinion pieces, we're used to letters to the editor, advertorials. All of those things are clearly labeled as such. Like if you read a letter to the editor, you know that that's somebody's opinion. If you read an op-ed, it says who wrote it, where they work. Like there's a little bit of disclosure there. Like this is an opinion. If it's an advertisement, it's, you know, they get a little tricky sometimes, but it's usually pretty clearly labeled as an advertorial or something like that. None of those disclosures exist on the capitalist. Like these on that website, these are all kind of posing as real news stories. So what we saw in some of that amazing investigative reporting that you mentioned from places like the Miami Herald, Orlando Sentinel, we saw basically the receipts of what was prompting that coverage. And it was emails from people like FPL's CEO, Eric Szilagyi, to his vice presidents, which then get passed on to these consultants, which then get passed on to the writers at the Capitalist, giving editorial direction down to like graphic ideas and, hey, this should be blasted, meaning probably like, hey, put a bunch of money behind this on social media, but literally marching orders from the most senior executives at this multi-billion-dollar utility to this little quote unquote news blog. And a lot of that coverage ended up being, with which should not be surprising, coverage that was very favorable to FPL, and coverage that was incredibly negative to anybody who criticized FPL. And they've gone after everybody, basically anybody who was willing to criticize FPL. There's probably some little blip about them on the Capitalist, including yours truly. And it was clear that this was just FPL consultants and senior executives seem to be using this as their mouthpiece. And the receipts that the investigative reporting revealed was there was real money every month going towards these operations.
I just want to highlight really quickly, like this extra added, having worked, you know, in the quote unquote mainstream media or whatever, for such a long time, this like additional really sinister layer of obscuring intention and kind of breaking down that wall between opinion and reporting. In this moment we live in, it's like, it's almost not forgiven, but it's like built in where you can just very easily write off by saying the Capitalist. Oh, like if you have some awareness of them, you kind of say like, oh, they're just, you know, a conservative rag or whatever. And then even just giving that designation to them gives them cover, because it's like, no, it's not about them being a conservative rag or a right-leaning outlet or a left-leaning outlet. It's about them running specific cover for specific corporate interests. And somehow the larger message of like, oh, well, these guys are compromised. They're biased. And it's like, oh yeah, well, everybody's biased. All media is biased. And it's like, no. This is particularly bad. This is worse than just ideologically being a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, or even a lot to the left, a lot to the right. This is paycheck journalism, or checkbook journalism, I should say. I'm sorry, Tomas, you're going to say something.
Yeah, no, and actually, I agree with that. You know, I mean, I've written, you know, pieces for example, Occupy Democrats. It's obviously like a partisan hack website, but the thing about Occupy Democrats is that it's not actively looking to lie to people beyond its clickbait um, content, right? This was a targeted, well thought out, clandestine operation meant to, exclusively and intentionally, deceive Florida voters at the behest and with the funding of our utility monopoly. And I want to give a little bit more context on, the capitalists. So this is, again, it's not just a conservative rag, right? It's a deceit, like sort of like intelligence operation, and the person who runs it is actually the ex-communications director for U.S. Senator Rick Scott. And I actually got a number of emails, and I obviously I can't disclose the source, but I released these emails on social media, on my Substack, out to the public, because there, the people that gave me these emails had concerns about releasing them themselves because of legal exposure. And these emails, which I have right now on my phone, uh, basically detail how, they were looking to hire, so-called top reporters from publications like Politico, to add credence, credibility to their operation. They literally had sort of a buffet of publicity that they could sell to different economic actors, right? For example, they had the healthcare sector. They pitched $2,000 per month, to run stories for them. The ag sector, they had HCA, which is Rick Scott's former hospital company. They had the for-profit prison sector, right, as one of
Prison,
their
yeah.
prospective clients. They had Mosaic, which is a fertilizer company that has been, closely tied to the algae bloom crisis that we have in our waterways. And they even talk about how Mosaic has become a controversial actor in Tallahassee, so we have to maneuver this with care. you know they talk about how when we go after critics of these industries, we have to do it carefully, and we have to remain distant of the actual industries, because the quote says they find this sort of political antics icky, and they don't want direct proximity and linkage to these activities. But make no mistake, they still want the activities done. And the most, I think, concerning part is that at one point, this guy that used to be the former communications director for Rick Scott talks about going, and there's no link, there's no proof that Rick Scott went for this, but they were trying to go to Rick Scott, who's obviously a multi-billionaire, estimated to be worth about $400 million, and they wanted to get funds with him to basically buy off all of Gannett's associated newspapers in Florida because their stock price was so low. And they talked about, firing. Literally,
Yeah.
I'm not being hyperbolic
No,
here. They
verbatim.
talk about firing all of the reporters in these newspapers, rehiring them with their lackeys, and basically they say, quote, syndicating content throughout the state through this network of newspapers that they would buy, and they say no one would know who's behind the scenes. So these people are sophisticated, it's disturbing, and they have real money behind them. And luckily, the capitalist has been exposed as, the pay to play rag that it is, before they were able to execute something like this, which was their true intention. But it's just really, really scary to think about, how much earned media they would have been, potentially able to control.
Yeah, and that's just one of the tactics. We talk about efforts to control the media or fire the media, or only have it be pay to play by special interest. Some of the other reporting that we've seen. So journalist Nate Monroe up in Jacksonville, he literally had private investigators on him. Like, there were photos of him walking the dog with his wife. They had no idea they were being followed. And of course, all of that happened after Nate Monroe. And to his credit, he has continued to do fearless investigative reporting, even though he's been surveilled, literally, him and his family. Um, So it's clear that these consultants connected directly to FPL seem to have no problem with direct intimidation of any journalist that is critical of them. I mean, that Florida Power and Light created an entire landing page devoted to trashing the reputation of Mary Ellen Klass at the Miami Herald. I mean, what are they scared of? The fact that
I want to mention Mary Ellen again with just like a caveat too, and show how sort of perverse this can work sometimes, because Mary Ellen is good at her job to the point where she actually is pretty well hated by other, legitimate real journalists who are just bitter about losing on stories constantly to her. And when that was happening, I think about a year and a half ago is when when the volume was really cranked up on the Mary Ellen class propaganda, anti-propaganda. There were, and I'm not going to name any names here, but there were plenty of sort of like mainstream or acceptable or like compromised journalists, just regular old journalists out there, and heads of some online journalism outlets out here in Florida who jumped right on that bandwagon of hating on Mary Ellen. And I think that that's particularly insidious, because it's like, it's a communication strategy where you can get useful idiots to kind of do a lot of your work for you. And that I saw that happening with Mary Ellen, and some things that I just knew were not true being passed around. And it's sinister, man, the way that played out.
Yeah, and obviously the DeSantis administration bandwagon on that, and Mary Ellen Klass has been, always a target of, Christina Pushaw and all these, DeSantis acolytes and cronies. But, I mean, Alissa, you've been a target of FPL. Jason Garcia, another, former Orlando Sentinel reporter who's done incredible investigative work around FPL and other, corrupt corporate actors in the state. He was the target of like text and a smear campaign recently. Obviously, Anna Skemani, there was a piece called The Dark Money Sisters targeting Anna and her sister because they basically work for nonprofits by the capitalist who was literally taking FPL money to write that story. They were literally taking dark money.
The hypocrisy.
To attack them for working for an issue-based nonprofit. So the hypocrisy is crazy. But there's, in terms of the surveillance, one of the emails, from this Matrix LLC consultants, and Dan Newman, this Democratic Party consultant, was in this, detailed how they were doing like dossiers on Daniela Levine Cava, the Miami-Dade mayor, who's widely seen to be an environmentalist, how they were working to smear Philip Stoddard, the former South Miami mayor, who had been on the thorn on the side of FPL because of his pro-solar policies. And how they were basically they hired a PI, a private investigator, to go after Stoddard. So they don't. This is like a practice that is widely used. They do it not just against journalists, but also against our elected officials. And I remember when we used to work for JJR, we used to joke all the time. We used to be like, "Yo, you probably have a PI. FPL is like surveilling you. Watch out." And we're kind of joking, but over time, it wasn't a joke. Like, they probably did have a PI on JJR. It's crazy.
Yeah, and this stuff has legs because, like, you just mentioned the Philip Stoddard, the way that's a mayor who's literally in my backyard. Like, if you go one street down from me, it's South Miami, and South Miami as a municipality, they really prioritized solar for a long period of time there, landing them firmly in the crosshairs of FPL. And what FPL did was, and I almost hesitate to bring this up, I'm not even going to bring it up except in broad strokes because it doesn't deserve to be repeated, but they found somebody who was willing to make some sort of allegation about Stoddard being creepy. And they turned that into a robocall. And how does that work? Is it just the thousands of people that get that robocall? No, the Miami Herald wrote a story about it. And just talking about that kind of stuff conjures it into existence. And then all of a sudden it's a controversy. It's a scandal. And it's manufactured from whole cloth. And it seems like that's the common, as we looked at it, and I'd really like to get into like kind of turn to like what happened to the JJR campaign and also talk about a name, Ileana Garcia, and how she fits into all of this, and another name, Alex Rodriguez, how he fits into all of this. But it's a whisper campaign, right? It's like something where it's all of this stuff is whispers. All of this stuff is like you try to it's gossamer. You try to touch it and it falls apart. You can't even really nail it down, which is why it's so sort of admirable, the reporting that was done on this in the recent months to out all of it. But Alissa, maybe you can talk to us now about what happened, what the end result is, and how effective this strategy ended up being with respect to this enormous public utility effectively silencing somebody who was proposing policies that were not in their interest. Like how did it all play out?
Well, by and large, FPL has been very successful in all of these dirty politics, all of their going ons with consultants and money being shuffled through this web of LLCs. At the end of the day, well, actually, before I jump into the results, I do want to just say I think it's important to kind of underscore the fact that FPL went to so much effort to distance themselves from all of this shadowy stuff. Like there's not, that's why they worked with consultants. That's why they worked through, this web,
firewall.
Literally when I was trying to follow. Yeah. So that somebody at FPL can say, I didn't know. Well, but you knew that your VP was talking to this guy who was talking to that guy, but it gives them some cover because FPL wants to be seen as like the heroic linemen that are right now restoring power. That is what they want Floridians to think about. They don't want them to think about the reality of what FPL executives are, which are profit-hungry executives figuring out how they can get more money out of Floridians. They don't want that image. Political operatives sending PIs after people. They don't want that. But they work through this web of, several layers removed so that they can achieve the end result, which is securing that political supermajority. We saw the first time that they used this kind of ghost candidate, like the third party candidate, to pull votes away so that the desired candidate won. We saw that in 2018 in the Gainesville Senate election race. And then we saw in the 2020 cycle, the three Senate districts that were targeted, one of them being JJR's, and the Republican won in all of those. So again, we talked about there's a four seat Republican majority in the Senate. So those are 4 seats, 2018, 2020, 4 years of power. Republicans had it. And I think in a large part due to all of the scheming from folks at FPL and their consultants, they played a huge role in that. There was literally millions of dollars worth of invoice between these entities and money being shuffled around to ensure that folks like JJR lost. And that he only lost by 32 points.
32 votes, 32 total votes.
32 votes.
Tomas, tell us about a name that people outside of Miami might not know, which is Frank Artiles, and then a name that literally nobody knows apart from baseball fans, Alex Rodriguez, and why those two names are sort of key names in this entire story of JJR.
So Frank Artiles is a former Republican state senator who resigned after inappropriately, obviously, using the N-word against his black colleagues. This guy was like a steroid.
It's a real class act.
Yeah, this guy was like a steroid, like rage-filled, just like an asshole in the legislature. Nobody liked him. He resigned. He was, basically off the grid for a couple of years. He resigned in 2017, and he pops back up in 2020, right? And the reason why he pops back up is because he I was going to use the word mastermind, but that would be too generous to be used in the context of Frank Artiles, but he was behind basically one of these ghost candidate schemes in South Florida, the one targeting Jose Javier Rodriguez. And what happened is that he basically went to this individual named Alex Rodriguez, comically named like the baseball player, and they bribed him to basically run for office against JJR. And the reason for that is because he had the same last name, and after they filed him as an NPA, like Alissa alluded to, these Matrix LLC consultants that were hired by Florida Power and Light spent money and time propping up the candidacies of these ghost candidates, sending mailers, sending advertisements, targeting Democratic voters, making it seem like this was the actual Democrat and this was the actual progressive in the race, and with the purpose of also confusing voters because these individuals, these candidates, share the same last name. And I also want to make this clear because this is the most ridiculous and maybe like comical part of this is that in Florida, it's not actually illegal to recruit an NPA candidate to run against another candidate. Like, if they would have done that without any exchange of money, they probably would have been okay. It's unethical,
Yeah.
but they probably would have been legally okay. But the fact that there was a bribe involved in getting this individual to run changes everything. And they were very, very messy in the terms of in terms of how they went about it, in terms of hiding it. Frank Artiles was heard on election night at a bar after JJR was announced as having lost his reelection, as being
Some
like,
real
I did that.
James Bond shit
I'm the
here.
one that took out JJR, and of course, spread word really fast. Word spread really fast in political circles. But yeah, just a really reprehensible, disgusting individual, and he was criminally investigated and indicted and charged. So he'll probably, see the inside of a jail cell because of this.
Oh, I was just going to say, Frank Artiles is also a friend of NextEra and FPL when he was in office. And actually, that was one of our very early clues before we even had any idea who this, who was paying for these mailers to these random candidates even before Election Day. As soon as Frank Artiles kind of popped up, I was like, oh, wait a second. Didn't he wear a NextEra jacket at a NASCAR event that FPL and NextEra were sponsoring? Oh yeah, it's on his Facebook page still. Oh, and wasn't he the one that had that legislation to charge Floridians for exploratory fracking in Oklahoma? Yeah, that was Artiles. He's buddies with FPL. Why is he? What's the connection? So little tidbits, but sorry I interrupted you.
No,
David.
I want to add, Alissa, that really shows the revolving door, in terms of public service and private sector grifting, right? A lot of these people get into public service to basically, increase their lobbying bona fides. And as soon as they are either, termed out or done with public service, or they lose their reelection, they immediately go to the private sector and a lobbying firm or the industries that they shilled for, and they make a nice little comfortable living, doing that. The thing that I think is comical and ridiculous about Frank Artiles is that there is so many ways of doing that sort of private sector grifting legally, but he's so stupid that he's like the one brute that got caught for it, because he was just
almost everything is legal down here. And if you
crazy,
it's like you could get away with literally anything. Like, people do this stuff all the time. I mean, like,
this ghost candidate scheme,
this exact scheme, like, literally open up one more checking account, like pay the $200 to LegalZoom to create one more LLC and create a nominee corporation, and then you will be free for the rest of your life, and you can just do this stuff. Because
okay, well, let's not give
him ideas.
Yeah, we did.
I was gonna say that this guy Alex Rodriguez is like the human version of like when a person's name on Wikipedia is in red and you can't really click on it. Like, there's nobody here. He's like, disambiguation guy. He's like, no. He doesn't warrant his own entry on Wikipedia. Go ahead, T.
No, I know we're reaching top of the hour, but it's been pretty grim, and we've focused a lot on the corrupt nature of the system, and it's just been pretty negative. But I wanted to ask you, Alissa, what is, like, I guess, the horizon or the aspiration as to how the energy sector should conduct itself in Florida, and its relationship should be with Floridians, right? Like, what would be an ideal scenario for us Floridians in terms of our energy sector?
That's a great question, and I think the path to an ideal situation, an ideal relationship between Florida ratepayers and our utilities is going to take years of work, because we are so far down this rabbit hole of every possible regulation just being controlled by the utility industry. So it's going to take some work. I know, members of Congress are asking for Department of Justice to investigate. That's one thing that could happen, just so that we can get to the bottom and have some actual accountability for all of this stuff. Federal Trade Commission should be investigating. FERC is investigating utilities' use of trade association dollars, which is another aspect of this. The Public Service Commission could actually do what's in the best interest of the public, like their name implies that maybe they should be. In order for that to happen, the governor is going to have to rethink how those appointments are made, and that those appointments are folks that are actually going to do what is good for Floridians, as opposed to it being a political favor or a favor to FPL. We also have the Office of Public Counsel. That could be doing its job. Right now, it's a former utility lobbyist, thanks to legislation passed by our Republicans, signed by DeSantis. The legislature could be passing statewide emission goals. We don't have a statewide plan to mitigate emissions that are making things like storm surge so much worse. We see FPL right now working overtime to try and reconnect people. But I think what I'm thinking about is how decades of climate denial and inaction is one of the things that caused storm surge to be so bad. So I think an ideal future potentially looks like FPL and the other investor-owned utilities being held accountable as we transform into a state that is going to be truly resilient, as we have affordable bills that don't just keep going up and up and up as utilities continue to get cost recovery on fossil fuel. FPL, even in their most recently filed 10-year site plan, they're still projecting over 60% use of gas in the year 2031. This does not jive with their quote unquote real zero corporate goal. No. So in an ideal future, Floridians have some type of accountability and assurance that when something like real zero gets said, there's an actual pathway and there's accountability if those goals are not met. But right now, Floridians are literally just stuck paying the bill for decades of climate inaction and for dirty political tricks from FPL.
Could I jump in on that? Because at the heart of everything we've been discussing is FPL deciding amongst themselves the lengths that they're going to go to silence their critics and intimidate those who have an alternate vision of how we should be conducting energy policy. I just don't think it's sustainable for people to be we were saying we don't want to give anyone any ideas. Right now, if I were to say I'm really depressed today because Con Ed is running a online harassment campaign against me through their sock puppet accounts, those sock puppet accounts being newspapers that they bought when the price was it's just an insane dystopian situation. It's the relationship and the dynamic is untenable there. Would it take something like the state buying out FPL and having publicly owned energy so that for example, if something like this were to happen, you could at least have public officials investigated or on trial because they would be misusing public power? Because right now you really have people at the mercy of a private energy company. Again, don't want to give anyone any ideas, but would it what's next? They're going to start shutting off the power of people who criticize them and saying, oh, it must be your faulty equipment or something like that. Right now they're the ones deciding the lengths that they're willing to go to intimidate people.
The other aspect of that, Gerald and Alissa, I'd love to hear what you think about that. But the other aspect of that you bring up is that worries me. It's also the same issue with the insurance industry, where it's there's this private industry where there are people making millions of dollars. They're not in danger of, in the example you gave, Jer, of losing their $290,000 a year director level GS-14 or GS-18 job. They're in danger of losing millions. And what people will do to defend their compensation when it's got two commas in it is like you said, the imagination reels. You can't imagine what those kind of people will do to protect that. Sorry, Alissa, what were you going to say?
Well, Interesting. If anybody wants to dig into old Miami Herald articles, when FPL, because you mentioned, are they going to shut people's power off if they disagree with them? When FPL was in the early stages of their quote community solar program called Solar Together, there was actually, and I believe this was reported by Samantha Gross at Miami Herald. There was some correspondence indicating that they might prevent, I'm not sure the exact word that they used, but blocking, troubling customers from even participating in their Solar Together program. So that is actually not too crazy of a concept. I'm sure that it has been discussed. But yeah, I mean, it is, in terms of the question of like public power, there's not one solution to all of this. Even when you have, a city, for example, that's running its own power company, there's opportunity for corruption everywhere. People have had similar suggestions like, oh, what if the Public Service Commission seats were elected? Well, we just spent an hour talking about how election corruption happened. So no matter what kind of solution we're looking at, there's opportunity for corruption. So my take is that the focus needs to be on transparency and accountability so that voters and Floridians can at least make informed decisions when they get to the voting booth. That's just one thing. And that advocacy can extend to the federal agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, like FERC, like the Department of Justice. Law enforcement, they're already investigating the criminal charges here. That can and should extend so that we can have more transparency and more accountability.
Yeah, one thing I would definitely not recommend doing, having visited there a lot, is do not try to storm the FPL building on Flagler in Miami. That is one of the most heavily guarded buildings that I've ever seen in my entire life, that I've ever been in. And my dad was a prison guard growing up, and that place is one of the most fortified places I've ever seen in my life. Our guest today was Alissa Jean Schafer, a policy strategy and communications consultant who does research and comms work over there at the Energy and Policy Institute. Again, you can find her on Twitter at Alissa Jean or online at AlissaJeanSchafer.com. Alissa, plug time. Where else can people find some of your latest work, or where would you like our listeners to maybe educate themselves a little bit more on this topic?
Yeah, so for energy policy wonky stuff, I would highly recommend checking out Energy Policy Institute's website, which is energyandpolicy.org. And the other aspect that we've discussed about, of course, is investigative journalism, sites other than The Capitalist, like these fake news sites. So this is my plug to subscribe to your local newspaper, figure out who the investigative reporters are that are actually doing real investigative reporting, pay attention to the news, and support that, because that work, I mean, if it weren't for investigative reporters, even like Glenna over at Channel 10 in Miami, she did some amazing work on the local news side of things, breaking some of this open, actually knocking on people's doors and figuring out what was going on. So my plug is to support your local news efforts, support your investigative reporters, check out energyandpolicy.org, and research who is on the ballot so you don't get confused by a weird last name NPA candidate.
Yeah, and if you stumble upon a website that runs recurrent positive stories about your energy utility, red flag. Just
have some questions. Yeah.
Question that.
Yeah, send it to me. My DMs are open for tips on Twitter. Absolutely.
And we don't care because our check from Capitalist already cleared, so they can't take the money back.
That's all for this episode of Why Are We Like This? Be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts for more episodes, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Visit us at WAWLT.com. Follow us on Twitter at Wolt Show, and on TikTok at Wolt Show. You can also email us at wolt@allpointswest.net. Until next time, this was Why Are We Like This? Wolt Mafia Rising.